Session. So I'd like to introduce Lynn Holt, who will introduce our session and our presenter for today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, either on Zoom or in person in the Oak Room. Last week, we heard from Dr. Ken Wald, and he discussed polling and gave us some better understanding, I hope, of surveys and polling. Today, I'm introducing Dr. Michael Martinez, who's a professor and graduate coordinator in the Political Science Department at the University of Florida. His broad research interests include the relationships between partisanship, issue preferences, and vote choice, as well as the causes and consequences of voter participation. His work on the socialization and reinforcement of Canadian partisanship has been supported by a grant from the Canadian Embassy. He has also collaborated on projects that compare the effects of religious attitudes on political attitudes across national boundaries, examine how much or little variations in turnout matter to the outcome of elections, and examine the role of ambivalence in shaping public opinion and voter choice. So please, welcome, Dr. Martinez. Thank you. I'll turn that over to you, Dr. Martinez.
Thank you, Lynn, and good to see you and many of the others that I've seen at these events previously when I was in person. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so thank you, everybody. I just wanted to talk with you today about who the voters are and what might be going on with turnout and why the Florida legislature, as well as several other legislatures around the country, were what they were trying to do and changing some of the legislation related to elections looking ahead. This is the outline of what I'm going to talk about today is who turned out to vote in the 2020 presidential election. Who did they vote for? And I'll look a little bit at Florida's Senate Bill 90, which Governor DeSantis signed into law after passing the legislature that made some changes to the election law looking ahead. Dr. Wald talked to you last week about surveys, and I'm glad he set me up well here. The primary data source that I'm going to use in today's talk is the American National Election Study conducted in 2020. So the ANES did 8,280 pre-election interviews starting in August of 2020 up until Election Day. And then they went back to try to interview most of those respondents, and they were able to successfully re-interview 7,449 of those respondents in post-election interviews that took place soon after the election and through the end of December. In previous years, the ANES interviews have been largely in person, so they would send interviewers around the country. This is a national probability sample of the voting age population of the United States. And so they would send interviewers around the country to primary sampling units to interview respondents that had been selected for the survey. In the last couple of American National Election Studies, they began experimenting with internet surveys, using internet surveys as a complement to their in-person surveys that they did. And that experience became particularly useful in 2020 because the pandemic prevented them from doing in-person interviews. So almost all of these interviews were online. Some of the interviews were conducted by telephone for people who preferred to have their interviews done by phone. A few of them were conducted by video online, but just to let you know that these were not in-person surveys largely because of or almost exclusively because of the pandemic. So what I'm going to do is, so this is the reported turnout of folks who answered the "Did you vote for president?" question in the American National Election Study. So 77.3% of the respondents in the American National Election Study indicated that they had voted in the presidential election in 2020. That is a bit of an overreport because while turnout was relatively high in the American presidential election in 2020, it wasn't that high. My colleague Mike McDonald estimates that it was 66.8% of the voting eligible population. So there's, as Ken may have talked with you about, there's a number of reasons for over-reporting. Some of it is what we call social desirability. People maybe think it's a norm to vote and they don't want to confess to violating that norm, but there are other reasons as well. It may have been easier for ANES to reach people who were politically interested. And because it was a panel study, it's possible that the interview before the election may have stimulated turnout among people who might not have already voted. And so the fact that the ANES did a panel study might have actually increased turnout among that group a little bit. That was a very expensive mobilization effort, though, in terms of trying to get people to vote. So the data that I'm going to show you overestimate turnout just a little bit by this amount. ANES also, of course, asked about vote choice for the presidency, and it overestimates Biden support and underestimates Trump support by a little bit. This is almost within sampling error. So it's not quite as stark as the difference in turnout because there's less of a social desirability element here probably. But the ANES sample is a little bit more pro-Biden or said that they, more people said that they voted for Biden than actually did in the presidential election. So with those caveats in mind here, what I'm going to do is look at several variables, demographic variables, and we're going to look for each demographic variable. I'm going to show you which group voted the most within that demographic. And then the next slide I'll do for that is to show you how that group voted among those who said that they voted. And what I'm trying to do here is to show that sometimes these things are linked, that the groups that vote more may be biased in terms of their preferences. So that's what we'll look for here. All right, so the first demographic, it's widely known that, and this has been true for many years, that we've been doing surveys and analysis of turnout in the United States, that turnout varies a lot by education. There's some debate in the literature as to how much this is causal and how much this is selection as to whether people who are politically interested are more likely to go to college, but it is still very much the case that college graduates are much more likely to vote than people who have not completed college, and certainly those who never attended college or never completed high school. So turnout rates among college graduates are in the high 80s, low 90s. And then those who had just finished high school, their turnout rate tends to be is around 68.6%. Remember, this is an overestimate of turnout. Among the people who voted, then I'm looking at who they said that they voted for in the American National Election Study when asked who they said that they voted for. And what we can see here is that the college graduates tended to prefer Biden by a fairly healthy margin. Those with bachelor's degree by about 60% to 36%. And then among those who are less than high school, that's not a very large group in the population. The less than high school also preferred Biden by a very small margin. And the middle, those in the middle, those who had just graduated from high school preferred Trump by a small margin. So so among people who college graduates were more likely to vote, and when they voted, they were more likely to vote for Biden in this particular election. Income also is education and income are both what we think of as part of class. As you might expect, people in the higher income categories are more likely to vote as well. Those who reported making more than $130,000 a year, about 88.5% of them said that they voted, and those in the lowest income category, those who reported making less than $40,000 a year, voted only at about 59%, according to ANES self-reports. There's not a lot of variation, it turns out, in who the different income groups voted for. The highest income group preferred Biden, but Biden also got a pretty healthy advantage among the lowest income group as well. And there's not a lot of variation across the income groups in terms of their preferences, which is a little surprising given the importance of class-based issues in the United States. ANES also offered to conduct the interview in Spanish, either online or by video or by telephone if a respondent preferred. And so I'm just using this to sort of get a little bit in terms of the language diversity within the United States. Not very many people took that option. But among those who did, turnout was lower than those who chose to do the interview in English. Turnout among the English language interviewees was around 77%, and those who preferred to be interviewed in Spanish, turnout was only about 61%. But the Spanish language interviewees preferred Biden by a really substantial margin here. So the English language interviewees preferred Biden as well, but not by nearly as great of a margin here. So you can see there's some variation both in turnout and in preference here by language of interview. By race, so ANES and I coded race and ethnicity together here. So the highest turnout group were white non-Hispanics, followed by Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Black non-Hispanics had a pretty good turnout. They're sort of the third category there. And when you control for education, which I did not do here, when you control for differences in education, Blacks at the similar levels of education, I didn't actually check this in 2020, but in 2016, African Americans with similar levels of education voted at higher rates than white non-Hispanics do by a very small margin. But basically, education captures the difference between whites and African Americans. There are not a lot of Native Americans in the sample, but among those that there are, their turnout rate was a little lower, and Hispanics were the lowest turnout rate in the ANES. And this matters because the minority populations, especially African Americans, favored Biden by quite a bit, but white non-Hispanics favored Trump. So the highest turnout category was the most different in terms of its vote preference here. And of course, white non-Hispanics are the largest of the categories as well. So there's some differences in vote choice by race and ethnicity, and there are also differences in turnout by race and ethnicity. This is religious attendance. Ken Wald has had a terrific career studying the effects of religion on politics, and one of the things that he kept reminding me of is the importance to look at religious attendance in looking at turnout. Those who attend religious services more frequently had a little bit higher turnout than those who didn't, even though it's reverse correlated or correlated negatively with education. So religious attendance has a pretty strong effect on voter participation, especially when you control for other variables like education and income. So those who attended religious services almost weekly or every week were more likely to have voted than people who didn't attend religious services at all or very infrequently. And again, what you can see here is that makes a difference here. Those who attended religious services almost weekly or every week preferred Trump by a fairly wide margin. Among those who attended almost weekly, it was 57 to 41. Among those who said that they attended weekly, it was 59 to 39. If the occasional attenders, those who reported going to services once or twice a month, were about even. And those who never stepped foot in a church or a synagogue or a mosque, they were heavily in favor of Biden. So vote choice religious attendance is important in terms of its effect on turnout, but it also is correlated with vote preference as well. This is religious tradition. The mosaic of religious traditions in the United States is quite rich. So these are very broad categories here. The Jewish respondents in the ANES reported the highest level of turnout. And they, I'll show you on the next slide, they tended to favor Biden. The problem for Biden was that it's a relatively small number compared to the other religious traditions in the United States. So mainline Protestants and evangelical Protestants after Jews had the highest levels of turnout, followed by Catholics, Black Protestants, non-Judeo-Christian. So these would be, and this is a very plural group. So this is anything Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Buddhists, any other non-Judeo-Christian religion. And the nuns here, those are people who don't, who say that they don't have any particular faith, or they're agnostics or atheists as well. And here you can see a big difference here, as I mentioned on the right. The Jews who responded in the ANES survey were overwhelmingly in favor of Biden, and this matches other surveys that Ken and I have looked at of Jewish Americans in terms of their voter preference. So they were about 75% to 23 in favor of Biden, and that's a very strong preference for Biden. But the problem for the Biden folks is that they weren't a very large part of the population. The evangelical Protestants are a much larger part of the population, and they favored Trump by an almost equivalent margin. Mainline Protestants also favored Trump by a small margin. Catholics tended to favor Biden. Catholics have always been very close in terms of since in recent years, Catholics have been pretty closely divided. And this time they actually favored the Catholic candidate. Black Protestants are Black, and so they also favored Biden by a strong margin. The non-Judeo-Christian adherents favored Biden by a large margin. The nuns, the nuns are agnostics, atheists, people who say nothing in particular when asked about their faith. That's a fairly significant size group of people, and they also favored Biden by a fairly wide margin. So you can see here that the vote preference is divided a lot by religious traditions, with evangelical Protestants being the most supportive of Trump, Jews, Black Protestants, non-Judeo-Christians, and people with no particular religion favoring Biden in this particular election. And then this is the famous gender gap. I'm always fascinated by the gender gap because men and women live with each other, they go to church with each other, or they don't go to church with each other. They work together in many places, although women work differently than men do. They live together, they bowl together, they go grocery shopping, they go to the same grocery stores, and yet there are still differences between men and women. And this reflects a pattern that we've seen in recent years. Women report voting at a little bit higher rates than men do. Now, remember, this is not controlled for anything. So even though men have higher levels of personal income and higher levels of education, women still participate in elections or vote in elections at a little bit higher rates than men do. Not only is there a gender gap in participation, but there's also a gender gap in preference, where women tend to be a little bit more democratic in their preferences. And we see that again here in 2020, where 56.4% of women preferred or said that they voted for Biden, and 52.1% of men said that they voted for Biden. So women are more likely to vote and more likely to vote Democratic, both by very slight margins. But again, it's a little fascinating to me because men and women live in society together. And if they didn't, we wouldn't have a society for very many generations. So this is sort of I try to do a summary slide of the demographic variables, noting the highest turnout group in each demographic and which candidate was favored by the highest turnout group. So Biden does better among people who have highest levels of education, highest levels of income a little bit, those who were interviewed in English, and women. And Trump did better among white and non-Hispanics, which was the highest turnout group in the racial ethnic category, among people who attended services, religious services weekly or almost weekly, and among evangelical and mainline Protestants. So it's a little bit of a split here in terms of how turnout relates to voter preference here. All right, so I also want to look at the attitudes toward the political system. So we're going to look at trust in government and the question about whether voting is a choice or a duty. So the trust in governments is based on a scale, and it's a little deceiving because this is America. Nobody trusts government very much. And so it's a little bit deceiving, but you can still break it down into people who trust government not very much and not at all, basically. And across the trust categories, there's actually not that much of a difference in terms of turnout preferences. The medium trust in government people may vote at a little bit higher rates than those who are low in trust and high in trust. But there's not that big of a difference and I wanted to show this because some people would expect there would be a difference, that if you didn't trust government a lot of people would expect that those people wouldn't vote. But some of those people vote precisely because they don't trust the people in government, right? That they want to change the people who are running the government then. And again, there's also not a lot of difference. There's the medium trust people who were the people who were more likely to vote tended to favor Biden a little bit here. So trust doesn't really help in terms of looking at this very much. I raise it because it's a common variable that we do look at and an important variable as far as how much people trust government and will follow government's dictates and things like that. But it doesn't have very much effect on this. I do want to ask the group here, and anybody can chime in, but one of the questions that has been added to the American National Election Study over the last several years is do you consider, they ask respondents, do you think voting is a duty or a choice? I didn't set up a poll here, but I just kind of want to know from the group, if anybody wants to answer that and why you would answer the way you would. So do you consider voting a duty or a choice? Len, you want to start off?
Okay, I'm thinking about Australia here, but I honestly think that it should be a duty.
That it's a duty, and
Yeah,
why would you say that?
Because as a citizen, I think that it's imperative that you take some responsibility for the direction of your country, state, local community. Okay. Yeah, that's my answer.
Okay. Anne Marie, you had to.
Sure, I agree much with what Lynn said. And I think people who are always saying, well, in countries like Russia where they require voting with a penalty if you don't, I think here, if you consider it a duty, and you want to complain about people who don't vote like you and aren't educated, then the whole idea is to believe in the process that eventually those people will learn. So I think it's a
Okay. Okay. Russia actually doesn't have compulsory voting. Soviet Union almost had compulsory voting, but Russia doesn't now. But there are countries that do have compulsory voting. Anybody else that I don't want to embarrass anybody who doesn't want to be recognized, but did anybody think that it was a choice and not a duty, and why would you say that? Okay. I'm not surprised with this well-educated group at that. This is the turnout. As you might expect, people who said that it was a duty were more likely to have voted than people who said it was a choice. This is, let me look at the chat here. Duty, yeah. People who said it was a duty were much more likely to have voted than people who said it was a choice. About 90% of those who said it was a duty followed through on that sense of duty and voted. There were also about some people who said neither, and they were actually less likely to vote than those who said it was a choice. And those who said it was a duty also tended to favor Biden. Those who said it was a choice had a slight preference for Trump in this election. So people's attitudes toward about the political process will also affect turnout in ways that are correlated with their vote preferences as well. The highest turnout group, and when we were talking about system attitudes, was medium, and they tended to favor Biden by a little bit. And the highest turnout group among the duty or choice tended to were the people who said duty, and they tended to favor Biden as well. But now we're going to talk about issues, party identification, and ideology. So the American National Election Study asked about a variety of issues. I'm only going to present 4 of them, plus talk about where people said that they would land on a liberal conservative ideology scale and a party identification scale. So one of the questions that Annie asked, and I won't ask you to say what you thought about this, but think about how you would answer this before I show you the results. So one of the questions that ANES asked is there sometimes a trade-off between supporting the environment and business regulation? So some people favor more business regulation to protect the environment. So if you strongly favor that, think of yourself at 1 on this scale. This is a 7-point scale. And if you think there are too many regulations on business, and you would favor businesses favor fewer regulations on business, then place yourself at 7 on that scale. If you're really in between, place yourself at 4, and you could be at 5 or 6 if you sort of favor business, or 2 or 3 if you sort of favor the environment. So think for a second about where you place yourself on that scale. So the people who, so this is not the proportion of people who said this. This is the proportion of people in each category who said that they voted. And what you see here is the people on the extremes are more likely to have voted or to say that they had voted. And the people in the middle are the people who are less likely to say that they voted. So we're going to see this on several of these slides. So the people who have stronger opinions are more likely to cast a ballot. Among those with the strongest opinions, though, the people who favored the business side of this were a little bit more likely to vote than the people who favored the environmental side. So compare the 1s and the 7s, where the business 7s had higher rates than the environment 1s, and the business 6s had higher rates than the environment 2s. So there's a little bit of a bias toward the people who are pro-business on this question, casting their ballots. And so you're not going to be surprised at this. Then the people who favored business, that wanted fewer business regulations, were very heavily in favor of Trump, and the people who were favored more environmental regulations were very heavily in favor of Biden here. So the issues matter. People are sorting out on the basis of issues. I always look at the middle category here and see where voters in the middle category are. And as we saw, there weren't as many voters in the middle or the people in the middle category didn't have as high a turnout, but those that did tended to favor Trump in this case. All right, so the next question is a health insurance scale. And so think of how you might answer this question. I'm not going to ask you to say it publicly, but some people favor more government involvement, think that the government ought to be more involved in health insurance, that most people ought to be covered by government in terms of the health insurance, while other people think that that most people ought to be insured by private companies like Blue Cross and Blue Shield and other private insurers. And so if you think of yourself as being in favor of all government covering health insurance, place yourself at 1 on the scale. And if you think that insurance ought to be primarily covered by private insurance, place yourself at 7 on the scale.
Mike, I think you have the wrong slide there.
Oh, I'm previewing the slide. I'm telling you the question before I get to that slide because I don't want to bias you. Thanks, Lynn. So think about where you put yourself on that scale. So this is the responses. Again, this is the turnout rates by people on this scale. And again, people who preferred the private insurance companies having a greater role in health insurance tended to have the higher level of turnout, right? So people who favored government insurance at the furthest on the left of the scale actually had the lowest level of turnout. The differences aren't great, but those who preferred higher levels, more private insurance tended to turn out more, right? And not surprisingly, they also, when they turned out, they tended to vote for Trump. So the people who were on the conservative, what we would think of as the conservative end on the health insurance scale, tended to turn out more. And when they turned out, they were heavily in favor of Trump. Those who were at the wanted more government involvement in health insurance or thought government ought to play a bigger role in health insurance, they heavily favored Biden, which is not surprising given Biden's heavy embrace of Obamacare and other government programs. All right. So the next question is this spending services scale. It's about the same thing. It's reversed here. So those who favor, the question was, some people favor government providing many more services than it does, even if that entails more government spending. If that describes you, place yourself at 7 on this scale. And some people prefer the government provide or spend less, even if it means providing fewer services. And if that describes you, place yourself at 1 on this scale. And what you can see here again is that turnout is higher among the people who gave the less government kind of answer here. Those who wanted fewer services and spending tended to vote at higher rates than those who wanted more government and spending. And not surprisingly, those that wanted fewer government services and spending tended to vote heavily for Trump, and those who wanted more government services and spending to vote heavily for Biden. The question on abortion, ANES has been asking its question on abortion, so it's not really a very simple question, and it doesn't necessarily capture everybody's position on the abortion issue. But the responses that ANES offered is abortion. One response is abortion should never be permitted. Another response is abortion ought to be permitted only in cases of rape, incest, or the life of the mother. Another response is abortion should only be allowed once the need is clearly established. And then the fourth option is abortion should always be available to a woman as a matter of choice. So you can see that the turnout rates here don't vary as much as they do on the health insurance issue and the spending services issue, on the environment business issue. There are, little just minor differences in the turnout rates. So people who are basically pro-choice were just about as much likely to vote as people who are basically pro-life. But there are differences in terms of preferences, right? So the pro-choice people were much more likely to vote for Biden, and people who gave a pro-life answer or a moderated pro-life answer were much more likely to vote for Trump. So you can see the vote choices did, positions on issues didn't matter here. All right. ANES also asked people to place themselves on a 1 to 7 scale on ideology. So these categories were labeled from extremely liberal to strong, slightly liberal to moderate to strong conservative, conservative, or extremely conservative. And then a fair number of people, about a quarter of people, said they haven't thought very much about this. And, those of us who are tuned to politics all the time, hear these terms liberal and conservative, and we think everybody in the world thinks of themselves as one of these things. But, you put that scale in front of people and about a quarter of people just say, I'm not, I don't even consider myself a moderate. I just haven't even thought in those terms. So about a quarter of people said that. They also tend to be the people who are less likely to vote, right? So if you're not thinking in political terms that are, at least as they're often discussed, then those people are less likely to vote. And you can see here again that people on the extreme ends are more likely to have said that they voted. So people who said that they were either conservative or extremely conservative are a little more likely to have voted than people who said they were extremely liberal or liberal. But both of those categories were more likely to have voted than people who said that they were moderates or slightly liberal or slightly conservative. And here what you see is that the extremists were more likely to vote very strongly in favor of one candidate. Where Biden gets helped here is even the slight liberals were very strongly supportive of Biden, and much more supportive of Biden than the slight conservatives were in terms of their support for Trump. I told you I always like to look at the people in the middle. So the moderates on this question favored Biden by a big margin, by a 64 to 32% margin. And those who hadn't thought very much about it, who said that they voted, also preferred Biden by a pretty strong margin as well. So even while even while you think about the issues matching up with ideologies, they don't perfectly match up with ideologies in terms of how people chose this. And this is our party identification scale. Again, strong partisans, those who are strong Republicans or strong Democrats, are more likely to say that they voted. In this case, strong Democrats actually voted at a slightly higher rate than strong Republicans, although I didn't check, but I guess that's not statistically significant. But the weak Democrats were less likely to say that they have voted than the weak Republicans. So altogether, it looks like the Republicans may be a little bit more likely to say that they have voted than the Democrats do. We sometimes, Hollywood, sometimes, I don't know about Hollywood these days, but Hollywood back when Jimmy Stewart was making movies would sort of like valorize the independent voters. But here, the independent voters just don't vote, right? Only 51.6% of them said that they voted. And again, that's probably an overestimate. So people who are in the middle sometimes actually don't even participate in politics because they're kind of cross-pressured. They don't know, they don't have as strong opinions. They don't know what they want out of the political system sometimes. Some of them do. And you can see that party has a very strong force on people. Here, we often look at the defection rates, the numbers of or proportions of Democrats who said that they vote for the Republican candidate and Republicans who vote for the Democratic candidate. And Biden gets an advantage here. Republicans who favored, there were, although they're still a substantial minority, there were more Republicans, or a greater proportion of Republicans, who said that they voted for Biden than of Democrats who said that they voted for Trump. So the defections worked in favor of Biden this time. And the independents tended to vote for Biden in this election. So in terms of the attitude summaries, the environment, the highest turnout group were the people who favored business over or fewer business regulations on the environment. That group was the highest turnout group. They tended to favor Trump. The highest turnout group on the health insurance question were the people who favored private insurance. They tended to favor Trump. The highest turnout group on the spending services dimension was those who preferred fewer services and less spending. So they tended to favor Trump. On abortion, there's no significant difference in terms of who the higher turnout group was. On ideology, conservatives slightly, so that gets a slight advantage to Trump, and party identification a slight advantage to Trump in terms of the attitude. So if you want to, so kind of understanding why the election was as close as it was, think about, where people were on these scales and then who was likely to vote on these scales. And you can see that Trump got a little bit of an advantage here in terms of the people who were actually likely to turn out. So we also, ANES also asked about the method and timing of the vote and of course, these are only of people who voted. So I'm not going to show you turnout because all of these people said that they voted. But this became an issue in the pandemic election of 2020, where Democrats were quite afraid of people who said that of people not turning out to vote. So they wanted to make sure that they got their votes in. They encouraged them, a heavy campaign to encourage them to vote mail or absentee. And most of you who were following the election knew this. But this just sort of maps out what ANES finds in terms of the partisan differences or the differences in preferences between those who voted by mail or absentee versus those who voted in person. So the mail or absentee voters tended to prefer Biden by a heavy margin. Those who voted in person tended to favor Trump by a slight margin, or favored Biden, but not as much of a margin. What you can see here where it really made a difference is the election day voters versus people who voted a few days before. So they might have voted by mail a few days before, but they also might have voted in Florida and other states where they had the opportunity to vote early. And they might have also voted even a week or more before election day, either by mail or early voting. In general, the earlier somebody voted in this election, the more likely they were to have voted for Biden. Trump had a majority of those who said that they voted on election day, and Biden had majorities of people who voted a week before the election or more, and those who voted just a few days before the election. So all this leads to the second part of what I wanted to talk about. In some organizations, the Republican Party among them, but other organizations also said that the Heritage Foundation said that they favored laws that would make it easy to vote but hard to cheat. We heard this in the debate in the Florida legislature. We hear it in debates in other legislatures as well, is whether they wanted to make it easy to vote but hard to cheat. And it's actually, in principle, it's hard to disagree with that. With those of us who vote, want our votes to count. We don't want our votes to be diluted by people voting who shouldn't vote or casting illegal ballots. But we also want it to be easy to vote because we do believe in democracy depends on the participation of people to vote. So I want to look at some of the provisions of the Florida election law changes and see whether that makes it easy to vote or hard to cheat or both. So one of the provisions in the Florida election law changes would prohibit people who help others drop off mail ballots from possessing more than 2 vote-by-mail ballots other than their own, unless they belong to immediate family members. So as usual, legislation is complicated to say. But what this means is you can take your ballot for your spouse. If you're dropping off a ballot, you've got a mail ballot and you want to drop it off rather than mail it in. You can do that for yourself. You can also do it for an immediate family member, so a spouse or a parent or a child. You can do that for an immediate spouse or for a parent or a child who are living with you. If you want to do it for anybody else, you can't do that. You can only do it for 2 other people, right? So if you live in an extended household, say an aunt and an uncle live with somebody else, then you could only that a nephew could only take the aunt and uncle's ballot. But if they also had a cousin there, they couldn't take the three ballots to drop it off. That doesn't make it, the concern here for people who are worried about whether this is easy to vote is, don't forget, in the middle of the election last year, there was a lot of controversy about the post office. They were taking postal drop boxes away. We saw stories about right before the election season, they were picking up the blue post office boxes where most people would drop their mail. And there were stories about how that was going to slow down the mail. So a lot of people, me included, I had a vote by mail. I said, I'm not putting it in the mail. I'm going to go drop it off at the Supervisor of Elections office. I only dropped off my own, so I would have been compliant with this law here. But there were people who have extended families or just want to be nice to their neighbors and offer to take their votes in. This would make it a felony if you were taking more than 2 vote-by-mail ballots and dropping them off at one time. It does make it a little harder to cheat. There is a legitimate concern about vote harvesting, where groups would gather up a lot of ballots and take them in and maybe sort of separate whether they were voting for the quote-unquote right candidate. And drop them off. So it probably makes it harder to cheat, but it certainly doesn't make it easier to vote. This bill also requires election supervisors to assign an employee to monitor ballot drop boxes and creates a $25,000 penalty if they fail to do so. The election supervisors, they are elected officials. They themselves have been elected by the citizens of the counties in which they work. And I just don't believe you ought to be fining people, $25,000 if somebody doesn't show, if one of their employees doesn't show up for work at some time. This is it's just awful in terms of what they're trying to criminalize being a supervisor of election. It doesn't make it easy to do. This part of the law also says that those ballot drop boxes have to be monitored. They have to be at the locations for early voting, and they have to be monitored. And so this is the penalty for not monitoring it. The supervisors of elections are way up in arms about this provision here. I actually dropped my ballot off at like 6 in the morning because I'm up and I wanted to get it done, and I knew there was no traffic. And so I dropped my ballot at the Supervisor of Elections office downtown at 6 in the morning. It was great. There was no traffic. I just dropped it there, but I would not be allowed to do that under this case. So this certainly does not make it easy to vote. People who are worried about, we don't know what the COVID is going to be like, but people a lot of people dropped off their ballots because they didn't want to vote and stand in line and vote early, but this would force them to go to early voting locations to drop off their ballot. Does it make it a little harder to cheat? Yeah, I guess. It does require that somebody, monitor that the ballots are being dropped off. and that they're not dropping off more than 2 people who are not related to them, immediate family members. But it definitely does not make it easier to vote. This is the other provision here. You can't use the drop boxes after hours. This certainly doesn't make it easier to vote. May have a marginal effect on making it a little harder to cheat. This one requires a driver's license number or a state ID number or the last 4 digits of number of a social security number to request to vote by mail. Many of you and I requested a mail ballot in the last presidential election. This would require that you put your a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of a social security number on the vote by mail request. This one I'm not. It does make it a little harder to vote because there are some people that may not have a social security number or may not remember it, and may not have a valid driver's license. It may have lapsed or whatever. So there's going to be some people who wouldn't qualify to do that. I'm not, in one sense, it doesn't bother me a lot about this provision because it is analogous in a sense to showing a voter ID. You're requested to show a voter ID when you actually cast a ballot in person at early voting or on election day voting. So you're requested to show a voter ID. If you don't have it, you can cast a provisional ballot, but then you got to go get it. And so this sort of puts the burden on the mail voters, vote by mail voters, having an analogous sort of voter ID provision. But those voter ID provisions do make it harder to vote and possibly harder to cheat. I think this does allow the supervisor of elections to check a little bit easier to make sure that the person is a registered voter in the district, so that they or in the county, so that they can check the ID a little bit easier. So it does make it marginally harder to cheat, but certainly does not make it easier to vote. Again, when you make an address change, you have to do this as well. Previously, when you made an address change, you only had to provide your date of birth to provide identification of who you were. But the last 4 digits of you also have to provide the last 4 digits of the social security number or a driver's license. So this does make it a little bit harder to change your registration, and therefore a little bit harder to vote. I don't think it's going to affect. It'll affect some people. Those people who it affects a lot. But I don't think this is going to affect a lot of people here. This one will. It only allows a request for a vote by mail ballot to be good for the next general election rather than 2 general election cycles. Dan Smith and I did some research a couple of years ago, and we looked at people who had requested a ballot in the presidential election, in the 2016 presidential election, and looked to see whether those people were more likely to vote in the subsequent gubernatorial election in 2018. And they were quite significantly. It would have raised, if everybody had been sent a ballot, we estimated that turnout would have gone up 2% in the state in the subsequent gubernatorial election. So this is a big deal. And I don't even, I hesitated even to put the check mark on the hard to cheat here, because I don't actually know if it makes it any harder to cheat. It just really makes it harder to vote. I suppose they could say that this guarantees that a person really is still a valid voter. But, unless, there are people who pass away between elections. And so if a person who had died had requested an absentee ballot for the presidential election, votes in the presidential election, and then passes away before the gubernatorial election, or moves out of state or something, and doesn't tell the county supervisor of elections, then that would avoid the county supervisor having to send a ballot. But the county supervisors were totally, they were distressed by this as well. as I understand, because it was a lot easier for them just to leave a person on a list, and they would get a ballot in the next general election as well. So this does make it a lot. This will have a big effect on people's participation rates. This requires third-party voter registration groups to inform people that they can also register online. It sets tighter deadlines as to when registration cards may be turned in. So there are a lot of there are many voter registration groups that try to register people to vote. They understand that registration is a big hurdle to get some people to the polls. So many registration groups will go out and canvass or be at a mall or be somewhere else to register people to vote. So they used to be able to sit at a mall and or Publix or wherever, and with the permission of the store, register people to vote, ask people to vote if they were registered. They could identify, they could set it up at a church with the permission of the church, and they could register people to vote there. But now they have to tell people, oh, you don't have to do this, you can register online. And if you do turn in a voter registration card, it starts tighter deadlines on when those groups have to turn in the voter registration card. So it increases the burden on those third-party groups. The real fear here is that if they tell somebody you can register online, person will say, oh, I'll just register online and then not do it. And so that's the concern here, is it undercuts the efforts of voter registration groups. This one requires election officials to make sure that online registration can handle a large influx of traffic immediately before the registration deadline, and also requires that they take proper security cautions to prevent hacking. This provision actually is one that I like. The supervisors don't like it as much because it's sort of an unfunded mandate that they have to make sure that their online voter registration systems can handle a lot of traffic before the registration deadlines. They should be able to handle a lot of traffic. The question the supervisors have is whether they're going to have the resources to make sure that their computer systems can handle that. But in principle, this is the one provision that I think does make it easier to vote, because it should help people who are registering right before the deadline to make sure that their registrations are actually in order. This one requires that the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles help the Department of State in identifying changes to residences. So if you move to a different county and then go to the go to the motor vehicles office to change your car registration and your driver's license, this would require that they tell the Secretary of State that you've done that, so that they can keep your voter record up to date. This may help. We have a very transient population, so this may help students and others. The problem is the students and others who are transients who move from one county to another may not realize that their vote has been transferred. So students in particular may think that they're still registered in Broward County or Escambia County or Duval County, when in fact that because they changed their driver's license when they moved to Alachua County, they got their voter registration changed. So this is, in some ways it's easier because it keeps people in the right precinct. It makes them easier to vote, but in some cases it may not, because people may not know that it got transferred here. This one is really bad, I think. It bans state and local election officials from accepting a donation in the form of money, grants, or personal property from a non-governmental entity for the purposes of paying for election expenses or voter education or voter outreach. So if a third party was just interested in registering people to vote or educating voters about how they can register to vote, they can't provide a grant to the local Supervisor of Elections office to help them get the word out. And I don't even see why this makes it hard to cheat. this doesn't make it, and certainly doesn't make it easier to vote. It increases a barrier to voter registration, which is a big barrier to voting. So I think the legislature also ignored several things that the supervisors of elections wanted to do. I didn't actually write all of them down, but some of the things were they wanted to make it a little bit easier to have vote centers, to allow people from multiple precincts to vote at like a shopping center or something. And also they wanted to give supervisors of elections a little more flexibility, recognizing that Palm Beach County is, a lot different than Dixie County. So they wanted to allow the supervisors of elections to coordinate their election offices to serve their local populations as best as they could, without necessarily having the same statewide regulations apply to our large urban counties as applied to our smaller rural counties, where the situation is completely different. So I think on the whole, the Senate Bill 90, which the legislature passed and the governor signed, was intended. It's hard to conceive as to why it's not intended to address the disparity here. They're trying to make it a little bit harder to vote by mail, a little bit harder to vote early. That had it been the case in 2020 would have worked against the Biden campaign in favor of the Trump campaign. So on that rather partisan note, which I usually try to avoid, but I'll stop it there. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. At this time, if anyone has any questions, you can raise your virtual hand or here in the Oak Room. I see a comment in chat. Let's see what that is. Oh, that was back to the duty or choice. John Reiskin, go ahead.
How do you think the COVID situation, if resolved, will affect the election of 22, or if it's not resolved? In other words, if it's ongoing crisis or it's a resolved crisis, compare the two, and how did that affect the election of 2020? Would it have made any difference in the results?
Thanks, John. Good to see you. I think, and I will admit this is off the cuff, I haven't actually done the data analysis on this, looking at the ANES. This is sort of the first time I was playing with these data, was to prep for this presentation. To the last part of your question in 2020, I think that there were the people who voted against Trump had a lot of reasons to do that. Many of them were very intense in favor in their opposition to Trump. And the people who voted for Trump had a lot of reasons to vote for him. They tended to be very intense as well. But there were some people in the middle, I think, who we often think about retrospective voting in terms of how the president handles the economy. But it's not just how he handles the economy. COVID was a major crisis in the United States. And I think there were some people in the middle that voted against, or the balance of people in the middle thought that Trump did not handle COVID well, and that probably cost him some crucial votes. And so had COVID not occurred, and assuming nothing else had occurred that didn't occur in real life, I mean, it's plausible that Trump would have been reelected, I think, in 2020, because I think that there were probably some voters in the middle that voted against Trump, in large part because of his bad handling of the COVID crisis. So that leads to the first part of John's question, is what the outcome of COVID might be for 2022 in the midterm elections or in 2024. I mean, I think you can look at the presidential approval ratings. There's a lot that goes into those as well. And I don't want to say COVID is the only thing that goes into those. But Biden was doing pretty well in in June and early July when it looked like COVID was under control. Biden was doing a lot better in the polls when it looked like COVID was on the way down. And then the Delta variant hit. And our hospitals got full again, and people were arguing about whether to wear a mask. And so I think that other things happened as well as the messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. But Biden's poll numbers started to go down right about that point. So I don't want to say if COVID is like the flu by 2024, Biden will get reelected. Hell, we don't even know if Biden's going to run again. He hasn't really said, but I don't want to say that. But I think if it's still a mess, he would be in trouble if he's running for reelection. So thanks for your question, John.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, I guess I have one if nobody else does. There was a poll or a survey that was done by Northwestern and NPR about non-voters. Oh, well, can you hear me now?
We can now. You froze for a moment.
Okay, I'm sorry. There was a poll done by NPR and I think it was Northwestern's journalism school in about the 2020 election and the non-voters. And I think there were 80 million people who did not vote. And one of your graphs showed about a third of the eligible voting population doesn't vote. So when asked about why they didn't vote, it seemed like a large segment said that of those surveyed said that their vote didn't count, or they didn't think their vote counted. And when the survey results were interpreted, it appeared that that intensity of apathy had solidified between 2016 and 2020. I was wondering if you could comment on that. Do you see that trend continuing, or do you think that trend is actually valid?
I do. I would, but there are multiple ways, as you suggested. There's multiple ways of interpreting what those non-voters were saying. Some people may literally think that their vote won't count. If they drop it off at the Supervisor of Elections office, somebody's going to throw it away. So some people may literally think it doesn't count. Others might think it doesn't matter, right? That whether they vote or not. They might think that the system is so paralyzed that nothing is going to get done. Right. And, that there's some truth to that, if you want my opinion on that. Right. I mean, we have separation of powers at the federal level. We have division of powers between the federal government and the states. And that makes it hard to assess responsibility for what's going on. And, my God, we can't even raise the debt ceiling to allow the government not to default on the full faith and credit of the United States. So when government is paralyzed, I can understand why some of those voters may think that. And so that is so there's multiple ways to interpret that. One of the most influential works about political participation in the last 25 years was a book called Voice and Equality by some very well-regarded scholars at Harvard and Boston College and University of California, Berkeley. They argued that the reason that people don't participate when they don't participate, there's three big reasons. One is they don't care. And what Len expressed on behalf of those voters is in a sense not caring because they don't think it'll matter in terms of the outcome. Another reason why people don't participate is they can't. They don't have the resources to overcome the burdens of participation. Now, we don't think about a lot of burdens in terms of voting, but registration is one of those burdens, especially if you don't have a driver's license. But you got to think about it 30 days in advance to get registered. And it may be difficult in some places to get to the polls on election day if you live far away from the polls. So one of the reasons is you can't. And a third reason is nobody asked them to. And I think what that the last point has really, I talked about the voter registration drives, is that the activists have really gotten into that, saying we have to ask, if we want people to vote, we have to ask them to vote. And if we want people to vote for our candidate, we have to ask them to vote for our candidate. And so I think that word has gotten out among the activists. But there is still the sort of sense that some people may sense that either literally their vote's not going to be counted. I don't think there's widespread instances of ballots being thrown away. But I do think that a lot of people say, even if their ballot is counted, government is so paralyzed and dysfunctional that, that they're not likely to get their issue preferences acted on or their needs addressed by government.
Okay, Elliot, go ahead.
Yes, I had heard, I don't know if it's true or not, that in some states there were drop boxes for votes that were provided by private companies. I don't know if that's true or not. Could you add anything to that?
Not reliably, so I'm not gonna. So I'm probably like you. I think I have heard the same thing, but I don't know how reliable that information was.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Lynn, another great presentation. Any final thoughts or comments?
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for everybody who on Zoom and in the Oak Room for joining us. Next week, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Barbara Oberlander, who is going to talk about the power of women. So we had two presentations. First, Dr. Wald, and second today was Dr. Martinez, that set the stage as we drill deeper into who the voters are. And I hope you all can join us next week. Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Dr. Martinez.
Thank you, Lynn. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you so much. Stay well, everyone.